Hey everybody, I'm Sean Robinson.
I'm Carson Grubaugh, and this is Living the Line. Sean, you got a book that's dear to your heart from a while ago, I think, right?
Yeah, this is a weird one today. We're going to be taking a look at Mitsuru Adachi's short program. And in English, this has only been represented by 2 volumes. And basically, Mitsuru Adachi is one of the most famous, and I would argue most important popular cartoonists in the world. And yet he's been really unrepresented in English. And this was a series of short stories that in Japan were put out while Adachi was serializing other things. And every time he had an idea for a short story, it would go into a new, whatever magazine he was working for at the moment. And these were collected over time. And so the first volume, short
How
program
many
one,
volumes are there total in Japanese? Because when obviously I can't get a hold of a copy of that since it's long out of print.
right,
So I found 4 volumes
right.
that
I'm
have
pretty sure
been
that
like,
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's 4 total in Japanese. And like I said, every time he would just have enough for a volume again, they would just do another one.
okay.
And so the first volume is mostly stories from the 80s when he was working on his first really successful serials, Touch and H2. And then the second volume represents a lot of short stories that he was doing in the 1990s when he was finishing up H2 and he was doing other series. And my best guess is that Viz was using this as sort of a way to sort of test the waters with his stuff, because almost all of his work is long form serials. So, you know, H2 is like 30 volumes long.
Mm.
Touch, which is my personal favorite, is like 20 volumes long. So Viz in the 1999 2000 is not going to go put out a 20 or 30 volume series or announce a 20 or 30 volume series without having something else that was
Yeah.
commercially successful first.
Is this a
um
fair test of his work though? Like would the sales of this be indicative of the success of a long form story? Because
yeah, let's
these
take a
are
look at.
pretty varied.
They're super varied, and it's interesting because to me, being familiar with his serialized work, I can see these a lot more of him as him kind of blowing off steam. This sort of seems to me like what somebody does when they've been a slave to a weekly 20 pages a week for um 20 years, 30 years, now 40 years.
Yeah.
He sort of has a brief idea that he can't tie into the current serial that he's working on, and so he tosses something in to this instead.
But I
um
wonder if that was an unfair representation, because if you have
yeah,
a serial that has that hook,
right,
then you might get an audience that's like bought into the hook. When you read
right,
this, each story is, well, there are better and worse ones, but they're
right.
interesting in their own. But I don't know that you could look at this and say, well, you know volume 2 dropped off in sales. It's like, well, yeah, you released an anthology book and that's not going to
Right.
sell as well. So like that seems like an unfair assessment of his potential success in the American
Yeah,
market.
I think it is unfair, and probably didn't really do them any favors in terms of getting a really good assessment of his commercial potential in English. But Adachi has a lot of things going against him in terms of the English sales. For one, almost all of his serials, not only are they long, but they're baseball adjacent. Uh, and so
Okay, I noticed that in a lot of the short stories.
his best known series, or at least the one that was the first popular, was Touch. And you said that initial hook, man, oh man, Touch is really something else. It has what seems to be a genre story where you're going to be familiar with the sort of major beats to it, but then at a certain point in the series, something quite dramatic and ungenre like happens that is so dramatic it basically like I mean, it'd be sort of hard to overstate what a dramatic impact it made in real time on
How
people
many
who were.
volumes in was that though? Like, could they count on, like, by the end of volume 1, the American audience would know, or was it like volume 10 all of a sudden
No,
you?
like volume 10. Yeah.
Yeah, see, that's
Um,
a marketing problem because it's like you
it,
have to accept that they're gonna stick around for 10 volumes of baseball stories.
exactly right. I think the idea of baseball comics is fairly anathema to an English audience. At least that's the perception anyway. But yeah, these stories, you can tell some of them is this first volume is stories from the 80s, and so some of these would have run concurrently with Touch, or Rough, his boxing one, and you know it, the strength of them is definitely the punchiness, um, whereas the strength of his long form serials is definitely like how he develops it over time, and like you said, the main hooks and things like that. He gets to sort of flex a different kind of muscle. On the other hand, in his long form serials, he'll oftentimes have a chapter or two that's devoted to something totally different. um, taking a little brain vacation for 2 weeks.
Which I think, we see a lot of that when we look at the manga and we talk about, like with Tezuka or just these artists, where they'll do these kind of non sequitur interventions, or they'll just go off the rails, and we don't see much of that in the American audience. And we were talking about, like, we were talking to Jimmy about that. Imagine this happening in like a TV or show or something.
Right.
Like, I think that probably is due to that, like, brutal schedule that they keep. They just got, like, it's more standard for them to take that brain vacation.
Right.
Like, it has to be. And Tezuka set that was just accepted because the god did it, and so other people could do it.
Right.
And I like that in these stories. But I will admit that when I read, and we'll see it when we flip to volume 2, Sean had told me, oh, let's talk about short program. And like I said, I went and got just some scanlations online because I couldn't get the book. And I thought, man, there must be 2 short programs, because the second volume it seemed like I came into the like volume 2 of a different story. But once I got a hang on that, I liked it.
Right.
And it seemed
And
like in volume 2, he does a lot more of that play. Volume 1 struck me as, like, I thought it was a collection of short stories focused on romance. Like the
right.
first volume is very consistent in different views of romance.
Yeah, and part of that might be a reflection of, like I said, blowing off steam of what he was working on at the time. There's a few interesting callbacks to that in some of the stories where, he's got like a girl undressing, and then it says like, "Wait, don't forget, this is a girl's comic. You sold this
Yeah.
to a girl's magazine."
Yeah, that playfulness I like that, and his cartooning is fabulous. I was also curious, this is coming out in the 80s. He has those super photorealistic backgrounds that I associate with people running stuff through Photoshop.
Right.
How do you
And
think that they were? Yeah, that's a good example right there.
yeah. So
Um, what was the process there, do you think?
for a lot of these, I don't know about this particular one, but a lot of these assistant created backgrounds would be actually done with a photocopier. And so, if you're using a traditional photocopier that has an on off, it's not half toning, it's using the drum image, you can change the lightness or the brightness to basically knock out more or less detail. And then build in, for instance, the hatching on that afterwards. Like, to me, it's very possible that this is from a photo, and that the ruled lines in the top and the hatching lines were put in after on the top of the photocopy.
Yeah, that was my guess, but there must have been a lot of whiteout or something too to clean them up, because it looked so clean. And I imagine if you did it on a photocopier, it would be a little dirtier. Like, you get, like, Stan Drake, did a lot of that in The Heart of Juliet Jones, but it's a very different look.
Well, they
So I
also could have
imagine there
shot
must
it.
have been whiteout.
Yeah, possibly whiteout, or also possibly, I mean, they were shooting their own reference. So if you were using a standard camera, SLR camera, you could pop a red filter on there and get a higher contrast just from the start
Okay.
of the photography process. Um, yeah, so like you said, a lot of these are really romance based, and it really leads with a quite a strong one, with this basically a boy who works as a delivery person and has a crush on this girl who he works at this place he delivers for, and then this sort of pesky kid who's always hanging around. And the place that he's delivering for is always getting harassed by these thugs. And then he ends up finding out that the owner of the place can take care of himself. And not only can the owner take care of himself, the owner is actually engaged to the woman he's been interested in. And not only that, but the pesky kid is actually not a boy, but is a younger girl, um, who is the sister to the guy the girl he's been interested in. And and if you think that's a lot for a 24-page story, he packs it in. And basically the story ends with the kid who's been bothering him sort of promising, like, I'm not saying I'm going to look exactly like her, but I'm going to do my best.
Yeah, like, hey, we could date one day, I could be as cute as her.
Right.
Which was
And
odd indeed. I'll admit I had a hard time following that first one, maybe because I didn't realize I was reading a short story, so my brain was set for like just kind of an introduction to a world, and there was
right.
so much packed in. I wasn't in that mindset of following all the details. I thought it was an ongoing story. So by the end of that first one, I was so confused, and I had to go back and be like, wait a second, like on the gender swap reveal
Right.
too, I was like, was that the same kid? And I had to go back and really put it all together.
uh, and some of them have that sort of density to it where you realize, like, oh, he's just thought of this complete serial, but he doesn't have time for a serial, and he's just gonna slam it all in. And then other ones like Takeoff, the second one, um are a lot more sort of one note, uh where
And I
you've got
quite
this
like that one. I
yeah,
thought that one was really nice.
you've got this absurdly tall guy who wants to borrow his friend's television so he can watch a high jumper. And he's basically narrating how he's known this high jumper for years, and followed her through all these different things, and he knew her personally, but they barely ever talked. And it turns out that she has been possibly setting her high jump records to be the height of the guy.
Yeah,
Like
like there's
she
this mystical connection between them almost, where she knows how tall he is without even being in contact.
Right, or is calling his mom. It's not entirely clear, um so she's just decided at some point that she is gonna jump his height no matter what. And the story ends with her setting a new national record after having cleared his new height, which just seems insane. She actually sets it higher than she needs to in order to win. Um, and
There's a
then
double page of her jumping that's just a beautiful. I mean, he obviously like had a photo. There you go. That's so natural.
yeah,
Great composition.
you can also see his line here in a way that's sometimes obscured by the pages that have fairly heavy background. He's got this really fluid, very distinctive kind of line. Also, not really done any favors by the small reproduction. When
Yeah.
you look at his stuff a little bigger, like the standard, like the magazine size that it was coming out initially, you really see this sort of rubberiness that's really satisfying. He's got rubbery faces and rubbery figures and stuff too. Um, but his line itself has got this great sort of weight shift.
Yeah, and it's a subtle weight shift. It's not a really that's always been something I'm super envious of. Brandon does that a lot too, where it almost looks like clean line,
Right.
solid
It's
line, but it's just such a subtle shift. I can't do it. Like anytime I start to shift my line, whoop, okay, it's getting really big all of a sudden. So
Yeah,
I love that. I'm so envious of artists who pull that off.
I sort of trained myself into a taper at all expenses thing at the end of each line, and it can kind of give a sameness of effect as compared to something like this, which seems like he's like stroking the object.
Yeah,
Um,
it really is a lovely line quality. And yeah, I think that was one of my favorite. That's also where I realized, oh, these are a bunch of short stories. Okay, and my brain flipped. And that one, like you said, is more of a one note. I do feel like a lot of these were ideas he had for serials, and he was kind of testing out the waters on them. You're talking
right,
about they were testing the marketing here. There's a couple stories later on where I was like, oh, he's testing an idea for a book and trying to see what the public reception was. I like
right.
the ones like that were much more obviously like, here's just a simple like kind of magic realism little thing, let's get it out and be done.
Yeah.
And I love it, it's great.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the kind of success that he's had from our perspective, in the
Yeah.
United States. I mean, he's one of the most popular authors in the world. Him and Rumiko Takahashi are the two cartoonists of the past 4 decades who have consistently sold across the board to half a dozen audiences.
Mm.
Rumiko Takahashi can do a book that's aimed at kids. She can do a book that's aimed at girls. She can do a book that's aimed at male teenagers. She can do a book that's aimed at adults. And he's in that same class, that same category. Um, it's just got a bountiful imagination. It's kind of hard to imagine that kind of production. Imagine that you're doing a weekly book and you're also tossing out short stories when you have the idea. This other first one here is another one of those ones that sort of feels a little bit like O. Henry-esque. This guy's on a date with a girl, and you keep on having these flashbacks to basically the problems that this guy has solved for her. He lives across the street from her apparently, and guy was like going to attack her, but then like a baseball flew through the window, and she had a gas leak, but then she got a phone call that woke her up. And you go through this first date that they're having together, and you realize a little bit past the point that she does that this guy is a stalker. He's been
Yeah.
watching her from across the road. um and this is not an unknown theme in Japanese comics, but the neatness with which she realizes this and then dispatches him, where she leaves him on a ride. Would you mind if I came around sometime? Sure, she says, and he's smiling. And then the next scene is his telescope coming out.
Yeah, pointing out the window, and she's moved and left a note that says goodbye. I really like that one too, the way it built up. You get like the creepy vibes all along, really. I love the last scene where he's like
Sitting in his own filth, basically.
well, no, sorry, the penultimate scene
Oh,
where he's kind of trying to be charming by like, man, I can kind of just guess who you are. So
right.
like, oh, let me guess, like, oh, this must be what your room is. And she's like, yeah, that's right. And then he goes through and lists off like the features of her house, and that's where she's like, okay, obviously you know this too well, this is, you're a creep. There's
I'll bet one.
if
Yeah, I
sorry,
bet
go
the
ahead.
toilet's on the left side of the bath.
Yeah, it's like he describes it too much and gives himself away. I love that. There's a TV show that I really enjoyed. I haven't watched I think there's 3 seasons now. I've only watched there might only be 2, but I've only watched the first season. It's called You, and it's basically the same thing, like this guy that is presents as the perfect boyfriend, but he's really just a manipulative stalker. Uh, so if people like that kind of story, and then I think it's been a while since I've watched it, but I think there's a pretty good twist at the end of season 1. Uh, so I would
Yeah,
recommend that TV show too.
his stuff has that same kind of lightness that you might expect from like what they call high concept television or movies, where you can explain the concept in a sentence, but basically everything can spool out of that. I think it's a tribute to it, though, that I'm hesitant to say what the concept is behind my favorite series. The one that I dream about there being an English production of Touch. I mean, it's been like 35 years since it came out or whatever, but uh, I
You don't.
still would not want to spoil it.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's fresh in a way. And part of the reason it's so fresh is that how well observed all of his stuff is. And in that particular series, one of the things that's really well observed is a sibling rivalry, um, which is interesting to me because Adachi was actually, he got started as a pro at the age of 19, but his brother, who's 2 years ahead of him, had already been a pro at that point. Um, and I think that there's some of that rivalry is probably well observed within his own family. And you get
Interesting.
some of that in some of these stories. One of the other ones that I really pushed a lot of buttons for me was, let's see if I can find the name of this one here. Um, well,
There's
yeah, so
after the Stalker one, there's like a two-parter, which is
yeah,
interesting, and that one ends kind of abruptly, but it's like he's like sitting there like stacking the pages up, like
right.
done with this story,
And
and
the
the story's
character's like,
called
"What about me?
yeah,
Hey, what
and
happened to me?"
there's like a
He felt
van flying into space, and the story's
right,
called What's Going On. So that's where I was like, okay, now this guy's just playing,
right.
having fun, and I
Now,
appreciate that.
yeah, no, that is definitely the one that's like just exploratory. These, you know, um, yeah, and then the next one at the intersection, this guy has basically been going on essentially a date with this girl he sees at the same time every day. He sees her at the same intersection, and they just look at each other, and then they go. And then he ends up seeing her inside of this place called Jonathan's, which appears in lots of the stories. It looks exactly like a Denny's to me, but what do I know? Um, and he's there with his friend's new girlfriend, and his friend leaves to go to the bathroom, and
To take a dump, as they put
right,
it.
exactly. And the girl who he sees at the crosswalk all the time sees him there and sees him with this girl, and the girl's holding his hands, and then he doesn't see the girl at the crosswalk anymore, and it's basically just this horrific, worst case scenario where this person he's been dreaming about, he's never going to see again because he's, been seen in front of her in a aberrant light.
Yeah,
But
well,
then
like she's seen someone else, so I'll leave it
right.
alone.
But what it basically boils down to is his friend has been scammed into buying these tickets, overpriced tickets for hot springs. And what you see at the end of the story is that the girl at the crosswalk is sisters of the guy who scammed them into the hot springs, and she's going to go on the hot springs tour too. And so the impression that you get, he's basically praying as he's walking through the crosswalk at the end. He says, "Come on, God, I'll sacrifice the 15,000 yen, but just please let me meet that girl one more time. Takeshi, the light's changing." And it's just
Yeah,
like such a
and
great
you
sentence
get the
to end
sense
on.
he's about to get hit, right? But you don't really know. And that's another one where it's nice and short and wrapped up and self-contained, which is those are the ones I appreciate the most of what he's done. Those ones where it feels like he's testing out a series didn't land for me as well.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. That used to be called in TV parlance, that was called the backdoor pilot.
yeah,
You're watching the original series of Star Trek, and all of a sudden there's an episode with a bunch of characters you don't know or care about, or are doing a bunch of stuff you don't know or care about. And that's because they were attempting to pitch a series by having a single episode. And I think you're probably right. There's probably a little bit of that happening in some of these.
the
Um,
opening of volume 2 is definitely that. The first
right.
two, I feel like that's not even a short story he tried. I feel like he tried to start a new series and it didn't go anywhere. So then they just shoveled it into
Right.
like, well, these are his short stories.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Um, this one, Current State of Affairs, is probably my favorite. Where basically it's a high school reunion happening once again at the not Denny's, uh, and everybody's awaiting the arrival of the class. Stud muffin in his Benz, and the one guy, it turns out, who really knew him and was friends with him during that time, hasn't talked to him since then. And the class stud muffin basically gets drunk and starts talking about the girl that you know he was supposedly dating at the time, and giving an impression that he's going to tell reveal personal information that she told him in confidence, and the guy punches her and punches the stud muffin in the face, and they get into a punch up, and basically you just sort of see that nothing that he's done since then has matched the heights that he was at then, and he's never really been satisfied at all. And you know,
Which rings true.
it does. And it's one of those stories where you know, he finds out that the other girl really liked him all along, and if this was like a really pat sort of conclusion, you might expect that he ends up with her at the end. But he doesn't. He goes home to his quiet sweater knitting girlfriend. You know, that other girl belongs in the past. And this particular image with the totally black and the sort of whited out figures, I thought was particularly nice. He does this, you know, you saw this in that same panel in the other one where he's giving it a little bit more of like a up isometric perspective where, you know, these guys, if they were that far away, unless it's taken with a telephoto lens or something, would be smaller. But instead we're seeing them essentially floating in an undefined pictorial space that sort of lets them have this spiritual connection as they leave. They dissolve
That
into
works.
this.
Sorry, go ahead.
They dissolve into this halftone mist here.
Yeah, and that works, like especially if these are coming out in late 80s, early 90s, like the world was really primed for that type of perspective because of the video games, you know, the isometric RPG games that were coming out at the time. Like we were all really willing to accept that up meant away.
Right.
And
yeah,
like
exactly.
down meant towards. And it is like, it works very well. It's a very striking image, and even the shadows being in white, which is so bizarre.
Yeah,
it really works. And the
well,
long
they're
panel
outside
that
in the
goes off the
snow, but
page.
they're outside in the snow and it's all black. It's almost like you're seeing like a after image or something.
Yeah,
like if you stared at it for too long and then closed your eyes, this is almost like the, you know, the after image you'd see.
I want to try that now. Yeah, that makes sense.
And then yeah, and you know, there's another one about someone sort of like love misuse of people's sort of sexual powers and misuse of sexual advances and things like that. He uses this technique fairly frequently when there is any kind of combat. A lot of his long form serials don't really have any combat, but what they do have is a lot of baseball, and this is basically the same thing, where all of a sudden his contour lines have a lot more openness. They're not closing up the form, and he's got the hatching that's following the direction of the motion.
The variety of width gets thicker too.
Right. So they're punchier all of a sudden, and oftentimes the, you know, he'll make the what would you call it, the larger sort of hair hatch brush stuff a little bit more movement.
Like it moves more towards like what we saw in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and with those big thick strokes.
Right.
I really like the beginning to the next one too. This is where again you see the artist inserting themselves. I wish I knew what it said on the back of that guy's back. He's got a note taped on his back.
Oh, it says Weekly Girls Comic. Ciao, Weekly Girls Comic.
Oh, that's the translation. Okay.
Yeah.
But I like that he's drawn this sexy girl in this. Oh, that must be the editor.
Right. That's the editor. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. The editor's coming in and being like, "This is a comic for girls, dude. Like, quit drawing like your sexy perv." And then he goes right back to it.
Right. These would have been in color originally.
And the dog, I really like the dog in this one. Like the way he's drawn the dog.
This one is you know, a lot of the similar themes, basically like a girls' school. It's across the street from a boys' school, and the girls' school has all the problems of the boys' school with gangs and stuff, all girl gangs that sort of take the place of the male aggressors. But this class president enlists the help of somebody from the boys' school to take care of one of the girl gangs for her. and it ends up not working out so well. A pretty interesting departure, and it's interesting to see that this one is in a girls magazine, and basically, like, I don't know, I wouldn't have been able to peg ahead of time which one is which.
But look, that face there that you just got to, where he's all beat up, that feels
Right.
out of place.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about who's in karate, and there's definitely the next page too has all those action lines, and it's like an interesting mix up of the two, what I assume are typically divided kind of genres.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And show, like, I like that, and that's even in the story, like there's the division between the girls' school and the boys' school, but then they're interacting.
Right.
I like that. I like when you start saying, well, screw the boundaries, like the real world doesn't have genre boundaries like that.
Right. The deformity that he's got on the face on page 280, with the face being hit by the fisticuffs, is really something else.
Yeah, and that's what you're talking about, his ability to go back and forth and be successful, different ages, different genders of readers, like all of that. I think that's, it's very obvious in that story when they exist together, and they exist together fluidly.
Right.
I think that's really impressive.
Yeah.
And then
And then you were talking about the lead into number one, or number two. You're absolutely right. Feels a lot like it's a pilot for some type of detective.
oh, by the way, on
Material.
your volume 1, it reads left to
left to
right,
right.
and then your volume 2 reads right to left.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, so that also messed with me, because the scanlation that I got does the same thing. And so I was reading like it's an Americanized version, and it's all these romance stories, and then I get to what's volume 2, and all of a sudden I'm reading right to left, and there's 2 in a row that are like a father son or father daughter detective team.
Right. Yep.
And it had that longer structure with a lot of characters packed into one thing, and I was having a hard time following the story. And I thought, okay, well, this is weird, like this artist is trying out something different. And then I went to the next chapter, and it's the same 2 characters, but it didn't have like a part 1 and a part 2. Like when there was the ongoing story in the volume 1, it said part 1 and part 2. This was just like different titles, and I was like, what the hell, like, did I get the wrong book? Like the art looks largely the same. So
Yeah.
I texted Sean, and I was like, yo, like which one of these 2 am I supposed to be reading? He said, oh, it's the same thing.
It's interesting that so we skip ahead like 5-10 years for the stories in this other volume, and you can see a lot of his character art is largely the same, but then like things like this, he's let his assistants draw these characters. I mean, these are like characters that are appearing in just this one panel, and they're clearly drawn by somebody else. I mean, stylistically, it doesn't look like anything else in his stuff. The background usage is a little bit more heavier. The tone usage is heavier. It just seems like a slightly different kind of comic than his 80s stuff.
Well, that threw me off too. It was like similar enough, but
right.
It did feel like a different artist somewhat.
Yep.
Like especially there's a in the first one, there's these car chase scenes
Right.
that are like really, really nice, photorealistic, like what I associate with like Sanctuary or Crying Freeman. What's that? Ikigami? Is that his name?
Right. Yeah. Ikigami. Yeah.
Yeah, that. So I was like really confused, and I did not enjoy the 2 detective stories either. So I was like, man, I hope Sean doesn't want to be talking about this detective book. I hope he wants to be talking about the romance story book.
Did you find any of volume 2 to be as engaging as volume 1?
I would have to flip. Yeah. Oh yeah. I really, really like when he comes back to the romance page. The very next story I really liked, page 83.
Oh yeah, the seaside.
I forgot to send. Okay, so that story starts with some beautiful of that photo manipulated art, that big old long shot of the mountain and the train tracks there and everything, and then that one scene. Let me get to it, page 83. So page 82 and 83, he's asking this girl, what are you looking at? Are you scared? There's a butterfly caught in a spider's web. Are you scared of spiders? Nope. Okay, then set it free. Why? Because it's sad. You think so? The spider could have been waiting for a meal for days and finally caught something to eat. So like the girl's taking the spider side, like don't mess with nature. You're trying to save this beautiful butterfly, but you're gonna starve the ugly spider. Don't girls usually root for the butterfly? You think so? And then he's imagining the girl that he has a crush on advocating for the beautiful butterfly. And then the girl he's talking to says, okay, then what if it got caught while it was still a caterpillar? And he says, I might have some second thoughts. She says, they're all born the same, but you're only trying to help the ones once it's beautiful. Normal people don't think about that kind of stuff. And then she lets the butterfly go, or he lets the butterfly go. And she says, hey, it's your fault if the spider starves to death. And he says, yeah. And then he has like a wound on his leg. So he's like, not totally beautiful himself. And he has misunderstood that when he got hurt, that the cute girl they both look cute, but the one he's crushing on, that's like the beautiful one, he thought that she helped, but really it turns out that it's and she has a flaw. She has a mole on her thigh. The one that actually helped him.
Right.
And she's shy, and so she gave the other girl's name or something like that. And I thought that was that was one of my favorite out of all the first two volumes, because it's such a conceptually tight little thing. And that scene with the butterfly summed up what the whole story is about in a real nice way. And when he realizes like he was making that same mistake about kind of obsessing about the beautiful one and ignoring the caterpillar that hasn't bloomed yet, like I thought that was a really, really nice one.
Yeah, and as always, through his stories, I mean, he makes a really evocative use of, the environment where they seem to be speaking to the different situations every time that they use the environmental images. It's not just filler, or it's not just space saving. Although sometimes he comes in as a character and informs us, oh, had a missing page here.
Yeah, and I the second volume had more of that stuff too. Like this is where now he's in what, like the second 20 years of his career or something.
Right.
The second,
exactly.
and is needing more of that mental break. Like you can see it. The next one looks to me like he was trying a even shorter form, the 5x4p. I have no idea what that means, but there are like, it's all under one title, but it's a bunch of like maybe 4-page stories.
I think it's five 4-panel stories or something.
4-page stories. Yeah.
That
one, it was weird. It was like he was doing there's a coffee shop with just baseball news in the background, and somehow that ties into the story, supposedly what's going on in the ball game. I didn't really care for that one. That felt like trying some kind of short serial that didn't land. It was too obtuse for people, I think.
Yeah, I found it really interesting to revisit them with the sort of knowledge that these were done, at basically different decades, and obviously the through line is still there, but I think that both of these stylistically reflect a lot of sort of what was going on with the other serials that he had going on at a different time. If you thought any of these stories were interesting, I would really recommend you pick up Cross Game, which is his only long serial that's ever been released all the way in English. And Cross Game is another baseball story, another story about siblings, and another story that has quite dramatic genre shifts, let's say, and sort of caught people unawares. I find it to be really incredible, really great comic. I would probably try to make Carson read it at some point, but the fact that there's 8 triple-sized volumes
Hey, I'm down. I'll do it.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
mean, I'll probably just have to get a scanlation of it, but
Oh,
I'm down to check in on that. Yeah, I mean, I really like his work.
yeah.
Obviously his draftsmanship is amazing. It does exactly the thing I like with the rubbery characters and those photo manipulated backgrounds. Because they're short stories, I have preferences. The baseball ones and volume 2 goes more into like a bunch of like trying out ideas for baseball stories, I think, which is why we're not talking about the rest of it. But um I don't know. I'd be like, I don't know. The baseball thing doesn't land for me, but if you put it in the context of where something else is going on, yeah, I'm really curious to see that work, because it's not like I'm against baseball stories. Like if it's a good story, it's a good story. I mean, my favorite comic of all time that God, I wish it was translated, is The Climber by Sakamoto Shinichi.
Right.
And I love that about Japanese comics, that they'll like you'll never get a story in English about a guy who wants to be a mountain climber. I don't think it definitely not
Right.
stretched out for 170 200 issues or something, but
Right. And that's
they
and that's
do
part
it,
of the
they do it so effectively. It's literally my favorite comic ever, and so I'd love to see. Yeah, I'm sure there's a boatload more of that I'm unaware of.
and that's part of the necessary effect of telling a story about baseball. Um, I actually had an hour-long conversation. The first phone conversation I ever had with Dave Sim uh, was a couple days after I interviewed Gerhard, and we talked. And I told him that I had been reading James Sturm's *The Golem's Mighty Swing* at the time, and that I really liked it, but that the baseball didn't feel like baseball. And Dave went on a 7-minute monologue about why you could never have real baseball comics that felt like baseball in North America, giving like basically panel breakdowns, like this is how many pages you'd need to represent a game, this is how many pages you'd need to represent a season. You just would never be able to do it um, in North America, basically. And it was really interesting to me because, of course, I was obsessed with Touch, which is all about baseball, and, starting Cross Game, which is, of course, all about baseball. And so much he was, absolutely right. I mean,
Yeah.
all of his estimates were spot on because, like, Dave thinks in comics, he can just make estimates like that. And he just knows how to do it because he's the guy who, thought he was going to write about politics and a political campaign and only was able to write a chunk of it and then had to summarize because he realized 500 pages is actually not very long, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And he
so
doesn't
he
really expose himself to much manga, as far as I know.
no, exactly. So it was interesting to hear like one master craftsman like analyzing, essentially like giving like a page breakdown for a comic that he's never seen or read or knew existed, and being
Makes
totally
sense.
accurate.
Yeah.
Um, which is all to say that like when you read the Adachi baseball comics, you really feel the game in a way that would be impossible without the length involved.
Well, and as I'm getting more and more exposed to manga, especially these really long form ones, I am really starting to like that about the Japanese comics, is the decompressed storytelling. Because that's what, like, I think the shift in film has gone because of TV too. They've decompressed the storytelling and they're richer stories because of it. I had a student tell me 2 weeks ago, maybe, they were like, most of the students just read manga, but they had seen that Invincible cartoon that's on Amazon now, and so had gone out and picked up or downloaded or something. They got a hold of Kirkman's original Invincible comics, and they were like, it goes by so fast. And I said, have you never read an American comic before? And they said, no.
Right.
And they said, it
Right.
just goes so fast. And I was but it's weird because any particular manga issue to me, I get through the issue faster.
Right.
Like an American comic is a slower read for the one comic, but that's not what the student was talking about. They were talking
Yeah.
about just the story moves from like scenario to scenario so fast. And I thought that was so interesting because I've been thinking about that a lot. It was so interesting to hear it from the other side, that was their immediate reaction, is like, things just go by too quick. Like, what's
Yeah. That's I mean that's why basically no American comics have been successful in translation in Japan.
Oh,
You don't translate American comics in Japan. You might import the concept and get the rights to make your own localized manga, based on some of the concepts. When I say based on, though, it's very loose, like Batman is a baby and the Joker has to take care of him, like stuff like that.
Wow. Because they just say this stuff is too immature and
exactly, it's too crude, because it's not, it flies by. It doesn't have any sense of pace. It doesn't have any breath or pause,
Yeah, and there's the characterization is lacking.
Right.
The sense of person is lacking compared to what they're doing.
Right. Well, and the Japanese art has a fairly high tolerance for sitting in the moment. You think about art forms that are about relaxing, or meditating or bringing about a state of acceptance or something. That's just anathema to bam, bam, bam. This
But
happens.
also, they have the haiku, so it's like,
right.
I mean, they're very able to have like a condensed punch of something.
Sure, but a haiku is, that's true. A haiku is a condensed form, but a haiku is also, can be about a single moment. A moment that would be, ignored and gone. Not brought up. I don't know. We talked about and when we were talking about the Jaime Hernandez story, Death of Speedy, we talked about that guy in the background of one of those scenes and how he wouldn't make the cut with he was just too interesting looking for not being involved in the story.
I wonder if that would translate, even though it's a very short story, because he can pack so much into one panel. Like it's a collection. Each panel's like a punchy haiku, and there's so much in that moment. I wonder if that would. I don't know. It's too bad. It's too bad that stuff doesn't get translated. But I get it. I get why he would be an interesting. I would like to see a Japanese reader. If we ever have a Japanese sub watching the channel, read Los Bros Hernandez and Love and Rockets and let us know how that works in terms of pacing.
Well, thanks for reading along with us today. And, if you guys want to buy my copies of this book, let me know. And no, just kidding.
He'll never let go.
Good luck finding it. I think Cross Game is still in print. Really strongly recommend reading Cross Game. Don't read anything about it, just read it. And I think at least the first couple volumes are available online on the Viz website. They were experimenting with that for a while. And while you're at it, check out that Strange Death of Alex Raymond, eh?
There's that book up there on top.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Strange Death of Alex Raymond by Mr. Dave Sim and Mr. Carson Grubaugh, available in fine bookstores and comic stores internationally right now, except possibly not in Japan.
They need to translate that. I can't even imagine that book in Japan. They'd be like, what the? That make no sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking about the storytelling techniques in that versus the Cerebus decompression,
Yeah.
Dave and Gerhard took decompression very, very far. But Dave sort of snapped back to it, snapped back to condensing after maybe, a decade of primarily writing, prose writing,
Yeah.
That might have been the thing that sort of hooked him back into compressing everything to a point.
I would also love to see a Japanese take on Cerebus. Yeah. So tell us about Love and Rockets and tell us about how Cerebus translates into Japanese. All right. Thanks for following along, everyone.
All right. Take care, everybody.
You want to see all these books? Smash that subscribe button and the like button and the bell, and then you get them.